Good morning, everyone. My name is Neera Tandon, and I'm pleased to welcome you to the Center for American Progress Action Fund. I'm thrilled you could join us for this critical discussion of President Trump's disastrous policy agenda, which could really cover many things on a day that we're discussing healthcare, but also covers his budget and what he would like to do with how the federal government spends money. Joe Biden likes to say, and I quote, "Don't tell me what you value, show me your budget, and I'll tell you what you value." Throughout the presidential campaign, Donald Trump told working people that he shared their values. But his first budget proposal proves otherwise, cutting vital programs for American workers and their families, especially in the very communities that helped elect him. Whether it's cutting funding for job training programs or rural health care providers, or threatening more than 3 million people in rural areas who benefit from the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, also known as SNAP, Donald Trump is turning his back on people who put their family's economic security in his hands. These cuts would have terrible consequences for some of our country's most vulnerable communities. In fact, in the rural and small town counties that Trump won, 1/3 of families live paycheck to paycheck, a rate that is 24% higher than in urban counties. The president and his advisors claimed that his budget reduces, quote, wasteful spending, unquote, and cuts down, quote, on big government. But here's the thing. Voters aren't buying it, especially Trump's own supporters. People see that programs like Medicaid, programs like Head Start, programs like Meals on Wheels are programs that help people. They're not big government. They're not wasteful spending. There are things that actually help people get by. The president's signature health care bill would cause even more havoc. By 2026, it would leave 52 million Americans uninsured by the most recent CBO estimate. Since we don't have a final CBO estimate, I can't share that with you. But for the bill we have, that's where we are. So there's so much to discuss about an agenda that really works for working people versus an agenda that works against them. And to really kick off this discussion and the policies that we're facing, we're thrilled to be joined by one of our country's strongest champions on budget issues, and really a true progressive hero on Capitol Hill, Senator Chris Van Hollen. From protecting Medicare and Social Security to fighting for better wages and access to affordable childcare, Senator Van Hollen has spent nearly 3 decades standing up for working families in Maryland and across the country. And today, we're excited to welcome him back to Cap Action to hear his insights about what's at stake. He'll be joined by Cap Action's Executive Vice President for Policy, Carmel Martin. Come on up.
Well, good morning, everybody. It's great to be here at CAP. Neera, thank you and your team for your great leadership. And at a time when actual facts are more important than ever, your work in educating the public and holding public officials accountable is more important than ever. So we're very grateful that CAP does the good work that it does, and we're at a moment where we need you very badly. You know, today we're about 2 months into the Trump administration, so we're here today to take an early look at the winners and losers in Trump's America. And for all the people who believed that he was going to be a champion and fighter for working people, they're beginning to get a very, very rude awakening. They didn't see that disclaimer on the back of those hats that said, "Make America Great Again," that says, "For millionaires and billionaires." Except, I will say, those folks who are in his cabinet. They got the sign early, and they're where they are today. And I think it does make sense to go back and look at what Donald Trump promised voters, both on the campaign trail and in the early days of his presidency. In January of this year, after the election, when we started talking about repealing and replacing the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, here's what Donald Trump said. We're going to have insurance for everybody. There was a philosophy in some circles that if you can't pay for it, you don't get it. That's not going to happen with us. People can expect to have great health care. It will be a much simplified form, much less expensive, and much better. There's Donald Trump, January 17th. Here's what he said on the campaign trail back in May 2015. This was a tweet he sent out. I was the first and only potential GOP candidate to state there will be no cuts to Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. He actually went on to this tweet to say that Huckabee followed him, but he was very proud that he was the first to say no cuts to Medicaid on the campaign trail. He also vowed during the campaign to launch a massive infrastructure modernization plan within the first 100 days. We're now over 60 days in, and what we're hearing is, oh, maybe we'll do that next year. Even though that would have been one thing that would bring people together early. In fact, Senate Democrats have put forward an infrastructure modernization bill and said, you know, President Trump, we've been talking about this for a very long time. Maybe you'll join us, but that's not what he's up to. He also promised a phenomenal tax plan, and his Treasury Secretary said during the confirmation hearings, this is Secretary Mnuchin, and I quote, there will be no absolute tax cut for the upper class. Okay? That's what they said in the confirmation hearing for Secretary of Treasury. Well, in the last couple months, the rubber has hit the road in terms of rhetoric and reality, and we have Exhibit A in the form of their so-called health plan and Exhibit B in the form of their budget that those Trump promises no longer apply, and that he's betraying the voters who supported him and anybody who thought that he was going to be out there fighting for working people, because together those two proposals represent a complete reversal of everything he claimed to stand for when he was traveling around the country. As we know, so we're going to take a look at both these. As we know, when it comes to the health plan, it immediately increases the costs for millions of American families, throws millions of Americans off of health care altogether, and slashes Medicaid and Medicare while providing big tax cuts. And when it comes to the budget proposal, it's a great budget proposal if you can fly to Mar-a-Lago every other weekend at taxpayer expense. But as we're going to see, and as Neera pointed out with a couple examples, it's really rotten for working Americans and anybody who understands that we've got to grow our economy with more shared prosperity. So let's look quickly at the health plan. We've talked about this a lot in the last couple weeks, so I'm going to go through it quickly. But we're talking about winners and losers. So who are the winners? This health plan is really a Trojan horse for gigantic tax breaks, a big tax windfall for the wealthiest Americans. And here are two components of it, as you can see. In fact, the tax break to the very wealthy just increased yesterday in the Congressional Budget Office's update of this proposal, because they decided to kick the tax breaks in a little earlier than they had before. But you've got the right-hand column are the tax breaks to very wealthy Americans, families with over $250,000 in income. And then you have another set of tax breaks to insurance companies, the pharmaceutical industry, and other powerful special interests. And of course, that blue bar, the losers, are the 24 million people who will lose access to affordable care, along with a lot of other losers who are going to see their costs dramatically increase, and we'll get to that in a minute. But I just on that right-hand bar, just so you understand how those tax breaks to the wealthiest Americans are distributed. Okay, that last column, that big long column, that's the average tax break for the top 400 richest families in America. On average, a $7 million tax cut each. It's obscene. And then you've got millionaires, who are the next, they get $50,000 on average tax cut. And then you've got everybody else who over 250,000. But as you can see, the folks at the very, very top are getting an average tax cut of $7 million. So they're the winners, right? And again, a lot of them are in the cabinet of Donald Trump. Donald Trump actually does very well himself. We haven't seen all his tax records, of course, but people took the one that came out and discovered that he would also be a huge winner in the tax cut plan of his of Trumpcare, wealth care, as we also call it. So that may not surprise people in this room who never really fell for the notion he was going to be a fighter for the middle class, but it's a stark example to other people throughout the country about what the Trump administration is all about. So I should also point out that they have this tax break to insurance companies. Under the Affordable Care Act, we put a provision that said insurance companies could not deduct the bonuses that they pay to their CEOs and top executives, over $500,000. And they eliminated that. So all of you as taxpayers will now be subsidizing the multi-million-dollar bonuses for insurance executives. They got rid of that. So it's just one more example of who wins and who loses. Meanwhile, in terms of the losers, we know from the CBO analysis that in 10 years you'll have 24 million people off of their health insurance. Just next year, you're going to see the first 14 million lose that insurance. It's interesting to hear our colleagues badmouth the Congressional Budget Office. I was the senior Democrat on the House Budget Committee. I was actually in the room when we did the interviews for the CBO director, and this director was chosen by the Republican chairman of the House Budget Committee, now the Secretary of Health and Human Services, Tom Price, and the Republican Senate chairman of the Budget Committee. So they do very good work. Don't always agree with every little nuance, but overall they are right on track. And the fact is that Republicans and Donald Trump just don't like the truth as it's been presented. And we all need to remember that behind the big numbers, the 24 million people are real Americans, our neighbors, our colleagues, even people who are not directly benefiting from the exchanges or expanded Medicare or Medicaid are benefiting from lower premiums through our employer-provided health insurance. But for people who are directly benefiting, this is going to be a huge loss and literally could put their lives at risk. I got a note from a constituent named Jenny, who lives on the eastern shore of Maryland, who wrote to me and said she's afraid for her life because she depends on the Affordable Care Act for her access to her treatments that are keeping her alive today. So these are big numbers, but behind each of them is a real person. Older Americans are especially hard hit. People in the next couple of years are going to see their premiums go up overall, but you're going to see older and lower income Americans especially hard hit. This shows what happens to a 64-year-old. So older Americans between 50 and 64, before you're on Medicare, are going to see whopping increases in their premiums. This is for a senior made around $20,000, $25,000 income, 64 years old. According to the Congressional Budget Office, we'll see a over 12,000, close to 13,000 increase in their premiums, putting them over 14,000. And just so people understand, if you're younger and you're a lower income, you're struggling, you got a job, you're working hard, but you're not paid a lot, you're also going to be facing an increase in your premium under the CBO analysis. So young and old, and especially lower income people, working people who are struggling, are going to be hard hit. So those are the losers. And I want to stress the fact that all of us are losers because of the ripple effect on employer-provided health insurance, which, while health insurance prices have always gone up. There's been this sort of fake discussion. Why they went up under the Affordable Care Act. They were going up much faster before the Affordable Care Act. They're going up more slowly now than they had in that period before. And that's because people now have access to preventative care. They're not showing up in the hospital, unable to pay for their care, which of course drives up the insurance for everybody else. So people are really going to get socked from these provisions. And then there are the cuts to Medicaid. And I showed you early on that slide, that tweet, promising that he would not cut Medicaid, bragging about the fact that he was the first Republican presidential candidate to make that pledge. And yet this now cuts $839 billion out of Medicaid. It hurts children. It hurts people with disability. It hurts seniors. A lot of people don't realize, but 2/3 of the money spent in Medicaid is for seniors in nursing home and getting long-term care and people with disabilities. Yet he has this very dramatic cut to these people. You may have seen just within the last week, there was an interview with Paul Ryan in National Review. You see, Rich Lowry is interviewing Paul Ryan, and Paul Ryan says to him, you know, I've been dreaming about restructuring and cutting Medicaid since you and I, he points to Rich Lowry, since you and I were drinking out of a keg. I don't know about all of you when you were in college drinking out of a keg, but I certainly wasn't dreaming about hurting seniors and kids and people with disabilities on Medicaid. And yet, for everything Trump said on the campaign trail, this has been a goal of Paul Ryan and the House Republicans for a very long time. For Paul, since he was drinking out of a keg, but since I've been in the Congress, all of the Republican budgets have called for close to $1 trillion in cuts to Medicaid over 10 years. So Donald Trump, despite what he said, is just going along with this long-term plan that goes after these Americans who rely on Medicaid. And by the way, Medicaid currently funds through extended Medicaid, expanded Medicaid under the Affordable Care Act, substance abuse and mental health benefits, which obviously help with folks with opioid addiction. So what they're doing is going after those people as well, despite what Donald Trump says. And I will tell you, rural hospitals will be especially hard hit. We're hearing from rural hospitals on the eastern shore of Maryland and western Maryland. So the good news is people are catching on. What you see here is the Quinnipiac poll that just came out a few days ago that shows that only 17%, only 1 in 5 voters like this plan. And it has overwhelming opposition. And what's interesting is among independent voters, it's even a little lower in terms of the support. Only 14% support the plan. Overwhelming majorities oppose the plan. And so clearly, despite their effort to get this through in the middle of the night, get it through before the Congressional Budget Office reports are done, thanks to all of you and people around the country who are having rallies and organizing, the word is getting out. And we need to keep getting the word out. And of course, we have a showdown vote tonight in the House of Representatives. And we're all hoping this plan that simply benefits the very wealthy at the expense of everybody else goes down in flames. We're all working hard to make sure we try and do that. I will point out that the Freedom Caucus is working hard to try and make it even worse. And as some of us pointed out yesterday, though, they have to be very careful not to be conned by the President of the United States and Paul Ryan, because they have asked to eliminate, this is the Freedom Caucus, the so-called essential benefits package, and they've tried to insist on putting a work requirement into Medicaid. I should point out that most people on Medicaid are very hardworking families, struggling families. Others are disabled. But in any event, those two provisions that they want to add in, the Freedom Caucus wants to add in as a condition of their support, are both going to be dropped out of the bill if it ever gets to the Senate under what we call the Byrd Rule. They are not compliant with the Senate rules of the Senate. The parliamentarian has ultimate say, the parliamentarian on these issues, but it's pretty clear those two provisions. So we're letting the Freedom Caucus know not to be conned by the guy who thinks he knows the art of the deal here in putting provisions in to get their votes that will never survive in the Senate. So don't be duped, don't be conned, and hopefully they won't. So let me turn briefly now. We see that the voters are catching on to what's so bad in Trumpcare. And then on top of that, we, of course, had the arrival of the Trump budget. And I do want to just, as we talk about the budget, put up this chart. This is a little bit of a policy wonky chart. I understand that. But it's really important because what it shows is the categories of expenditures in the federal budget. And the columns on the far right are the amount we spend on an annual basis for discretionary spending. One is defense, and you can see we spend more on defense every year than non-defense. Non-defense includes everything else: NIH, the FBI, Fish and Wildlife Service, national parks, veterans, Homeland Security is in non-defense too. So those are the what we spend every year. The next two are Social Security and health programs like Medicare, Medicaid. And the last one, according to the Congressional Budget Office, are tax breaks. In other words, special interest provisions that have found their way into the tax code that if you eliminated, you would raise that amount of revenue. That's on an annual basis. So we spend more on tax breaks. Economists call these tax expenditures. It's income that does not come into the Treasury because someone got a special deal for themselves. And that's the largest category of spending in the budget. And of course, there are tax breaks in the Affordable Care Act will make this even larger. So that's the budget. But then well, I didn't mean that was supposed to be the last slide. But anyway, let me just go back here for a minute and talk about what's in the budget. And Neera covered some of these things. You know, if you're going to run on a platform that you want to invest more in job creation and working people, and especially build a middle class, why would you submit a budget that cuts the Economic Development Administration, which is an important tool for funding small businesses in local communities? Why would you cut the Manufacturing Extension Partnership, which is a federal program that helps disseminate important new information on innovation to small businesses and factories and manufacturers across the country? He eliminates that. There's a really important program called the Community Development Financial Institutions Funds. This is for small banks. It's not for the big Wall Street guys. The Wall Street guys are fine in this budget, by the way, and obviously they're doing great under their tax cuts in the healthcare plan. But for the small community-owned banks and institutions, lending institutions that actually provide seed money in the communities, they whack that entirely. And I would say these organizations leverage about $12 in private sector capital for every $1 of public money put into those. So this is going to hurt local community-based job creation. We talked about infrastructure. If you go back and look at the tape from election night when Trump realized he'd won and we all realized what happened, the only issue he actually mentioned that evening was modernizing our national infrastructure. Only issue. And he said he was going to come up with a big plan in the first 100 days. Well, as you can see, that's not how they're spending their time in the first 100 days, but it's worse than that. It's not only that they're not doing something positive, it's that they're cutting the transportation budget by 13%. They're wiping out altogether what are called New Start projects in the transit area. So what that means is they will continue to support some of the funding for transit that's already in the pipeline where agreements are already signed, but no new starts, no new transit investments, no public dollars, federal dollars for that purpose. Then they eliminate the Tiger grants, which was a really important innovation that says we should invest some federal funds in nationally important strategic transportation investments. Wiped out. wipe out the Tiger grants, wipe out the New Starts projects from a president who claimed he wanted to modernize our infrastructure. Healthcare, well, we're taking a pounding on healthcare in the bill, but we actually had bipartisan agreement to invest more in our biomedical research in this country, NIH. And we hear all the time from Francis Collins over at NIH that even before these cuts, they were very short on funding. We increased the funding last Congress so that we could get more young scientists coming up with more discoveries for cures and treatments. 20% cut to NIH in the Trump budget. And finally, if you live in rural America, you're not only hit by the things I just mentioned, but you get a double whammy. It cuts the agriculture budget by 21%. I'm fortunate I serve on the Appropriations Committee, the Banking Committee, the Budget Committee, and I'm the first Maryland senator since 1922 to serve on the Ag Committee. And we had the hearing yesterday for the nomination of Governor Perdue, to be the head of the Ag Department. Well, I can tell you, those Republican senators were not very happy with the Trump budget. Cutting 21% from the Ag Department included eliminating federal support for water and sewer systems in rural America. It wiped out entirely something called the Appalachian Regional Commission, which you may not know about, but it was a big story in the Post just the other day. And Western Maryland is, a number of counties in Western Maryland are part of that. It is really important seed money for rural areas that are struggling economically. A lot of the areas that Donald Trump, went and campaigned in, wiped out. In fact, when he came to Maryland in the primary, he went to Western Maryland. So they wiped that out. Then they also wipe out a number of other, as I said, some of the other programs related to rural America. And then if you're in urban America or suburban America, they whack the housing department by 13%, eliminate community development block grants, which are really important tools for economic development. We heard about Meals on Wheels being cut. They wipe out the education department's 21st century grants, which are after school programs. We need to invest more in after school, not cut them. And they cut funding for rental assistance and job training. So it is pretty much a direct hit on job development, job creation, trying to build a larger middle class in America at the same time as we saw they're providing these tax cuts. So who are the winners? The winners are the millionaires and billionaires and very powerful special interests. The losers are everybody else, including a lot of people who thought that Donald Trump was going to be the champion of working people, and his budget goes right after them, as does his health care plan. So that is why, in addition to the polling you saw come out in Quinnipiac on his health care plan, you're seeing Donald Trump's approval rating at only 37%, which is, as far as I know, an all-time low for any president at this point in their presidency. So people are catching on. We just need to make sure that they get the truth and the information so they can see what a bait and switch we've had here. And again, that's why it's important to have organizations like CAP to help us do that. So thank you all very much for being here. All right.
Senator, that was terrific. And I'm going to give the audience a chance to ask you some questions, but I'm going to take the moderator's privilege and start with a couple. I guess the thing that we're all on the edge of our seats about is obviously the health care vote today. And I think you did a really terrific job laying out why the bill is a bad bill and why it's so challenging for Republicans to move something forward. But would love to first just ask what's your prediction in terms of what's going to happen later today? They're stripping things like essential benefits out to move it to the right, but there's some moderates that they could lose when they do that, and it seems like very hard for them to get that balance.
No, that's true. I'd say normally in the House of Representatives, when you've got the leadership of either party pushing really hard to get something done, you can usually bet that they will succeed in getting those final votes. That's usually. Today, what's different is you're going into the final day before the vote. Of course, the final day was supposed to be yesterday, where you have about 30 Republican members of the Congress, of the House, saying that they're either opposing it or undecided, but many have said previously they were opposing it, including some members of the Freedom Caucus. That's a really big gap to close in 12 hours or whenever they're going to vote. And what we need to do is make it clear to those Freedom Caucus members, for example, that they're being made promises that cannot possibly be kept in the Senate. It's a total bait and switch, and they cannot go back to their constituencies in good faith and say they bargained for something and got something in the House bill when they should know that these things cannot survive in the Senate. I'm not going to go into all the background. This bill is being brought up under reconciliation, which means it's not subject to a filibuster in the United States Senate. So that's the benefit of Republicans using this procedure. They need to get 51 votes in the Senate. But because they're using that procedure, there are certain things that they can't put in the bill. If it's not sort of directly tied to the budget, then it falls out automatically under the rule of the Senate parliamentarian. So things like the work requirement in Medicaid, which doesn't have a primary budget impact, or getting rid of the essential benefits package, which doesn't have a primary budget impact, those things are highly likely to fall out. So the Freedom Caucus is spending an awful lot of time bargaining for things that won't survive, and I hope they won't fall for that. We need to make sure that people know that.
And what do you think the implications, if they are able to pass a bill, what do you see as the implications for the next election cycle? Do you think that the impact of that bill will come into effect soon enough that there's sort of a accountability for it?
Yes, even though if you actually look at the way parts of this are structured, parts of it are designed so that the greatest harm comes after the election. The Medicaid cuts and the end of the Medicaid expansion and things like that. But I think that you will immediately begin to see the fallout in the insurance markets, especially in the Affordable Care Act exchange markets. And so people will immediately begin to see, I think, the pain. And it is already, I think, having a political impact in the sense that people are figuring out what's in it and they don't like it. You saw the polling showing only 17% approve of their plan. That was before they made these other bad changes. And it is part of a larger atmosphere combined with the budget and this sense of betrayal that I think is making it difficult politically for a lot of Republicans in many states. So you can see it, for example, in their efforts to recruit Republican Senate candidates. They're having trouble in certain states, I think, because of the political environment that's out there. I do think that they're going to be held accountable for this vote.
I think you did a really good job laying out how he has contradicted himself over and over again. And in some ways, he talks a big game. He talks the talk, but doesn't walk the walk. He says he's going to do something on infrastructure, but then cuts the Department of Transportation and Department of Agriculture. I think the other thing that's really hypocritical of him is in some of these areas where he had, at least in the campaign, he's put forward an infrastructure package and a child care package. If you really dissect those proposals, it's, as you said, it's really all about tax cuts for wealthy people. The infrastructure package would be a great boondoggle for Wall Street, but wouldn't actually translate into a lot more infrastructure projects and actually would mean higher tolls for middle-class Americans. The child care proposal would be great for Ivanka Trump, but for your average working family, it would have very little assistance while giving Ivanka Trumps of the world big tax cuts. Are there things you think we could be doing to better call out that hypocrisy? Do you think that there'll be accountability in that, on those things? It seems like in those areas, he's being the consummate marketer. He's saying something, but he's not really doing what he's saying.
And this is exactly the issue. The issue is, when is the sort of false marketing going to catch up with Donald Trump. And obviously, it needs, for political purposes, it needs to catch up, not with the people who already suspected that he was never going to deliver on those promises, but those who hoped that he would. And I think that what the polling here shows is that with respect to healthcare, people are beginning to see the gap between, promises, which he laid out. Everyone's going to get better healthcare. It's going to be bigger and better and cheaper. And the fact that it's primarily benefiting very wealthy Americans in the form of tax cuts. And the budget, I think we're beginning to see the same thing. But you mentioned two other important things, the infrastructure plan. The Senate Democrats, as I indicated, put out our own plan that has a robust public investment component. And not that private-public partnerships don't work. We have that too. I mean, it's not all one or all the other. But it's interesting you raise that because especially in rural areas, the idea of essentially financing this through the private sector is not going to work because there's not a lot of money to be made for building a road in an area where you don't have a lot of people riding on the road. So rural areas are especially nervous. Senators are especially nervous about this. And again, the irony is that's a lot of where Donald Trump campaigned and got his vote. The child care is another really good example. Democrats have put forward these bills in the past. We're introducing them again. Senator Murray has a bill. Senator Gillibrand has a bill. These are, I introduced bills in the House, bills that really do help deal with the real challenge, which is making sure that working families and moms can have quality child care for their kids. We need that badly. That is important to working families. And the Trump bill, so far, I haven't seen
It's not
details.
actually a bill,
They
right?
don't have a bill.
As you point
but
out, he's not even really moving forward on that.
Yeah, so I think as time goes on, look, as we all know, it feels like a long time. It's only been about 60 days, a little over 60 days. And within that 60 days, I do think that they've lost a lot of credibility. That Quinnipiac poll also shows a pretty dramatic drop in trust. I mean, over a big majority of Americans don't trust Donald Trump, which from a national point of view, is nothing to be happy about. But we've been saying, if you keep doing the things you're doing, you're going to undermine not just your personal credibility, but actually harm the country. I mean, all this nonsense about President Obama, wiretapping his phone in Trump Tower, that's just contributing to his further loss of credibility, and for the country, makes it really difficult because whether friend or foe, people need to be able to trust the word of the President of the United States.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we'll take a couple of questions from the audience. We have someone with a microphone. I'm going to go to the person in the back.
My name's Deborah Schuman. I'm with Physicians for a National Health Program and Healthcare Now of Maryland. I've been working for many years trying to improve healthcare in our country, and we're looking at a draconian House bill, which, as Senator Van Hollen has told us, is not going to be able to go through the Senate. But I look around at the country, and there are a number of states, some of them the biggest states, California, New York, have shown great interest in getting some type of a single-payer system in their state. What would happen if the senators put an amendment into the Republicans' bill that said, let the states decide if they want something like new improved Medicare for all, or the Republican proposal, which is, what are they calling it? The American Health Care Act. And so my thought is that let the states decide what we want. I don't want the Republican plan. California doesn't want the Republican plan. New York doesn't want it. Colorado doesn't want it. Vermont doesn't want it.
So we have a situation where the states that have moved forward, not just with the exchanges, but obviously with also extended Medicaid, have helped provide much better access to more of their people, more of their citizens and residents than others. And I think those states where there's a commitment to providing health care, states are free to build upon the structure of the Affordable Care Act. I'm one of those who, strongly supported a public option as part of the original Affordable Care Act and would certainly, support going farther in terms of expanding things like Medicare. But for now, the risk of just saying to the governor that the governor, for example, a Republican governor, that you can do whatever you want, you can get rid of the Affordable Care Act, would make the people in those states vulnerable. I mean, they would have all their access to health care wiped out. You cannot be at all certain that they would, say, well, we're going to get rid of the Affordable Care Act, we're going to replace it with, a single payer in our Republican states. So you would be making a lot of people very, very vulnerable. That's why we've always, that's why Medicare is a national program, Medicaid's a national program, Social Security is a national program, because we want to cover all our people. And I'm all for giving, states the ability to expand on, what's already there in terms of affordable care. But I would not want to, give or just a Republican governor the ability to wipe out access to affordable care for people in the state.
And to a certain extent, in the most recent negotiations, the fund they created is trying to, as a counterbalance to getting rid of essential benefits, is a pretense that states can still do those things, but it's very narrowly defined and leaves it up to states to actually decide to provide the coverage, so it leaves a lot of people at risk.
It does, and what they're doing in Medicaid is also going to put a lot of people at risk, because not only are they dramatically cutting it, which means that states will have to reduce access to care for lots of people or raise their taxes, which a lot of these states will not do, and so it puts very vulnerable people at risk. But Medicaid is actually a program that already has a lot of flexibility, and you have a federal sort of baseline foundation. So you make sure that every state has a Medicaid program that provides essential sort of structure. But states seek waivers of the federal government all the time. And, in the state of Maryland, we have a lot of waivers for different programs. So states are very free to experiment under Medicaid. But if they're going to cut close to $1 trillion out of Medicaid and say states can block grant it too, in the end, these are going to be states that are not committed to health care in their states. They'll just use that money for something else, including, who knows, tax cuts.
Brent?
Thank you very much. Larry Checo with Checo Communications. I'm fond of saying that this city is chock full of smart people, chock full of smart people. Wise people, not so much, but that's not my. I've always wondered why the Obama administration did not brand its Healthcare Act as insurance reform rather than healthcare reform. You're not really reforming healthcare, and most people who get their healthcare are perfectly happy with it. It's the insurance and accessibility to healthcare that we're all concerned about. And I think he would have had an easier line if he had taken it. Thank you.
Well, thank you. So we can actually have a good conversation and probably agree that overall, I think a lot of us from the White House down could have done a better job in trying to explain the benefits of the Affordable Care Act. I think what's happening now is that when someone's threatening to take something away, all of a sudden you begin to pay a lot more attention. So for example, we've all seen the polling that shows that people like the Affordable Care Act, but they hate Obamacare. We've seen the polling in Kentucky where people like Kentucky Care, but that Obamacare, we don't want that in Kentucky. And so, yes, I think we could have all done a better job in terms of explaining the benefits of the Affordable Care Act, both to the people who are receiving it, many who did not realize that they were receiving benefits from the Affordable Care Act. Now that we're talking about taking it away, you can see that only 17% of the American people support this so-called repeal and replace effort. So people are now beginning to realize why this makes a difference in their lives. So I agree with you in terms of the marketing, in terms of what the Affordable Care Act did and what Obamacare did. But I think when stuff is put at risk, that's when people start saying, well, is that how I'm getting help too? And oh my God, that Republican plan is going to really hurt me.
Time for one more question.
Malcolm O'Dell. I've spent most of my career in international development thinking that the big problems are out there and come back to realize we're in trouble right here, big time. I think you're eloquently preaching to the choir here. I don't think there's any Trump supporters in this room, and if they are, I hope they'll stand up and identify themselves so we can realize that we at least have some diversity. But beyond that, we've got 24 hours on this bill. What can the people in this room do to make a difference? Most of us are D.C. voters and have no senators or Congress representatives. What can we do to move the needle? What can we do tomorrow, next week, and the weeks after in terms of specific action that people like us can take so that we can not just talk to each other and tear our hair out?
I hear you. Well, thanks for asking the question. I should say that, and maybe not surprisingly, but this is heartening. It's good news. It's probably the question many of us get asked the most these days because the enormous anxiety about what's happening in this administration. And in places like Maryland, where most of the representatives and senators, I think, see this Trumpcare for what it is, it's hard to know what a resident of Maryland or D.C. can do. So here's a practical thing. It may not sound like it's a huge thing, but it is. You've got to contact the people that you know in these other congressional districts and these other states where this is coming down to vote. People are, there are 30 Republicans right now, at least, who are undecided. Do you know anybody in their districts? Email them, contact them by Facebook, social media, whatever it may be, have them call. People do pay attention, I will tell you. It's not always determinative, but it's definitely a factor when people are calling in. We've seen a lot of these town hall meetings with both Republican House members and Republican senators. They're making a difference. You may have seen Senator Tom Cotton, for example, had a very rigorous, robust town meeting down in Arkansas. He's been one of the senators who's been saying, hey, House Republicans, you're moving way too fast, and you're doing things that you said the Democrats did anyway. Who knows what exactly the cause and effect is here, but my strong belief is that all the actions people are taking in these town hall meetings are already making a big difference. And so for people from this area, we've had a lot of town halls in Maryland. I would say we had 3,000 people at Bowie State University. We've had great turnouts. And what we ask people at those rallies to do is reach out to people they know in these other states and have them contact their members of Congress. You can call too. I mean, there's no harm in calling, but the most effective thing, of course, is to be contacted by your own constituents. And then those of you who are members of organizations, really make sure they're weighing in. We have a lot of organizations, whether it's to fight cancer or other diseases. It's really important that all of those organizations be contacting their members. We know AARP, for example. I mean, they often don't get really involved in these fights. AARP, is saying to older Americans, if you're between 50 and 64 years old, you're going to take a pounding under this Republican plan. So that's another way. People who are parts of organizations, getting your organizations mobilized, especially the chapters in these other congressional districts and states.
I would totally echo everything the senator said and just point out that if you go to the CAP Action website, we actually have we're working in coalition called Protect Our Care. We have a toolkit that basically lays out the members whose votes seem to be up for grabs, and it has some important data like how many people will lose coverage in their states or jurisdictions, and then has action items as well as our progress report, which we put out every day that has actions that people can take on a daily basis with respect to pushing back on the many terrible assaults on good policies. And I just want to finish by thanking the senator for everything he did today. It was a terrific presentation, and all of your leadership. We're so thrilled to have you in the Senate. I, as a Marylander, is particularly happy to have you in the Senate. So thanks for doing that.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
And thank you all for being here. Now, we're going to have a terrific panel come up and continue the conversation, led by Angela Hanks, who will introduce the panel.
For really excellent remarks and laying out exactly what's at stake here today. I'm going to start by introducing our wonderful panel, who's going to talk about a lot of the issues the senator raised in more detail. Andrew Kessler is the principal of Slingshot Solutions. Andrew is founder and principal and of the firm, which specializes in behavioral health policy. With 15 years of policy experience and over a decade in behavioral health, Kessler is a fixture in circles that advocate for substance abuse treatment, prevention, and research. Lisa Mensah is president and CEO of the Opportunity Finance Network, a leading national network of community development financial institutions, or CDFIs. Mensah was formerly the Undersecretary of Rural Development at the Department of Agriculture under the Obama administration, where she managed a loan portfolio of $215 billion, including $30 billion of annual investments in critical infrastructure for rural America. Neil Oranger is former senior advisor to the Secretary of Commerce. Neil was a leading voice on manufacturing in the Obama administration, where he helped lead task force for the Secretary focused on advanced manufacturing and U.S. economic development. And then finally, my colleague Harry Stein, who's the Director of Fiscal Policy here at the Center for American Progress. Harry Stein is the Director of Fiscal Policy, and his work focuses on tax and spending choices within the federal budget, and he's written extensively on topics including appropriations, tax expenditures, and the budget outlook. And not sure if I said it, but I'm Angela Hanks, and I'm the Associate Director for Workforce Development Policy here at the Center for American Progress. All right. So thank you, panelists, so much for being here. Really looking forward to this discussion. Andrew, I'd like to go to you first. So as we heard from the senator, there are a lot of things between the budget and the health care bill that are really potentially a disaster for millions of Americans across the country, and really pose a threat to basic living standards for many people here. So I know that your work focuses on substance abuse and mental health. So right now, as we speak, House Republicans are debating on procedural to eventually vote to repeal the Affordable Care Act and replace it with their own health care bill. This repeal comes as communities across the country are dealing with the impact of the opioid epidemic. President Trump's budget, which makes a number of cuts across a number of areas, this is actually a bright spot in his budget, is it includes a $500 million increase for opioid abuse. So in your opinion, does this on its own effectively address the crisis? Is that enough, this pledge to increase the funding?
No, it's not enough. The $500 million you referred to is really money that was already due to this issue when the 21st Century Cures bill was passed last Congress. The money in there was promised $500 million for last fiscal year and then $500 million for the next fiscal year to address the opioid epidemic. So when the president's skinny budget came out and it mentioned a $500 million increase, it was everybody's guess that that's what they were referring to. And you'll notice the increase was over FY16 levels, not FY17 levels. So that really gave away that the $500 million he was referring to was 21st century cures. In addition, that $500 million was supposed to boost what we already had, and it was supposed to be a supplement to what we already had. And what we have is not enough. A lot of this money that is going to opioid abuse and opioid treatment, it's phenomenal the way Congress has responded. Leaders in both parties have really stepped up, and it's something that's really united them. And if people want to see a true bipartisan spirit in Washington, they should look at the success of this effort. However, coverage for opioids is simply treatment, and we still have a lot of gaps that need to be filled in by what would be a, for lack of a better term, normal budget. We need better infrastructure. In rural communities, that would rely on the Department of Agriculture's rural health program, which was responsible for bricks and mortar. In HRSA, that would be workforce development. We don't have the workforce to take on the number of people who are gaining access to care. It would be increases to, obviously, programs like the Department of Health and Human Services, where we need more research at institutes like NIDA and the National Institute of Alcohol Abuse and Alcoholism. So there's a whole continuum beyond opioid abuse that still needs to be addressed. And the shortfalls in the president's budget, the compensation of $500 million doesn't even come close.
You bring up a great point. You know, many of the people that will be affected by these cuts are not defined by one single issue in their lives. So, you know, we can talk about opioid abuse and the addressing that, but ultimately, you know, that affects a number of other issues, whether it's housing or other things that affect people's lives. So, Harry, turning to you, Andrew highlighted that there are a lot of really draconian cuts in the budget, and they impact a number of different areas. One thing that is true, and the senator highlighted this as well, is almost no one is spared. So just to name a few communities that will be affected, low-income people, communities of color, LGBT communities, women, especially women who are low-income and women of color, people in rural areas and small towns, people who work in manufacturing. The list goes on and on. That's just a few. Harry, the Republican healthcare bill would hit many of these same communities a second time. So going back to what the senator talked about in the beginning, who are the winners in this budget if these are all the losers?
So I think, like Senator Van Hollen said, it really is amazing how common the theme of cutting taxes for rich people is. Even in things where it seems kind of weird that we're talking about tax cuts for rich people at all. So the healthcare plan has an enormous tax cut for the wealthiest Americans in it as part of repealing the ACA taxes. We hear a lot about infrastructure and childcare from President Trump on the campaign trail, and then come to see that his proposals are, again, just more tax cuts for rich people. And then his skinny budget doesn't talk about taxes, but what it does is it says, okay, we want to fund this defense buildup of questionable utility, and we're going to basically squeeze everybody else to do it. They don't have to do it that way. In the past, when Congress has wanted to build up increased defense spending, they've also increased non-defense programs, and they've looked to other parts of the budget, including the tax code, to make up for that. They choose not to do that. Instead, they're kind of squeezing everybody else. And again, all this is pointing to how do you give a tax cut to the wealthy. So that's one big piece. Another piece, and I think this oftentimes gets overlooked, when we look at the cuts in the budget, we think about, I think we first go to what does this do to people's basic living standards, as we should. I think that's first and foremost what we ought to be asking. But a lot of the programs that Trump is going after are really safeguards that level the playing field. And so when you see things like a huge cut at the Department of Labor, which enforces wage and hour laws, well, that's bad news if you're somebody who's getting cheated by your boss, but it's great news if you're the boss, you know, doing the cheating. And when we look at cuts at the EPA, huge EPA cuts, a former colleague of mine actually was a whistleblower in a huge investigation that the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel just published in mishandling of used chemical drums, where basically you have these companies making lots of money disposing of and reusing chemical drums, and there's procedures that they're supposed to follow, and there's laws for that, and there's supposed to be enforcement. What it turned out was happening was there is no enforcement. There's no cops on the beat, so to speak, from places like EPA or OSHA to do that work. And so the consequence is these really dangerous working conditions where, you know, if you mix the wrong two chemical residues together, they explode. And that's happened, and people have been very seriously injured. And the people that live in these communities are really at quite a lot of risk. And so what we're having then is this situation where the system gets rigged more and more with these cuts towards powerful elites, corporations, people at the top who can cut corners and make an extra buck. And it's Trump's skinny budget that's doing the rigging.
Yeah, that's an important point to pick up on. Is President Trump talked a lot about the system being rigged, and for many of his voters across the country, including in rural areas and small towns, that's what spoke to them, and ultimately they'll be harmed. So, Lisa, I want to go to you next to get the rural perspective on this. So, as Undersecretary of Rural Development at USDA, as I mentioned in your introduction, you manage $30 billion in direct investments in rural infrastructure. I'd just love to know about the impact of those investments, and if you could explain the risk to rural economies moving forward if it's not addressed. And then I would also, just to start your remarks, I think it would be helpful to get a better understanding of what rural America looks like, who it is, how they'll be affected, just for those of us that aren't as familiar.
Great, Angela, thank you. And thank you for elevating the rural perspective, which I think is so important and which this president is to be commended. The one thing we can thank him for is that he really tried to amplify voices that often aren't amplified. Rural America is, in my experience, beautiful. I think we don't say that enough. It is such a diverse country. I was in small towns in Alaska where you would just be so impressed with the level of what Native communities have done, how survival has happened. It's successful in many places. It is, I've seen date pickers in California. I've seen an Iowa with much more diversity than you would be surprised. I've been in Mississippi and in Kentucky. I want to start with the positives because it's an outstanding country. But this country works because of the way we invest in it. I think people would be surprised that, yes, it's a challenge. About 15% of the population of this country is rural. So it's about 46 million Americans, but it's 72% of the whole land mass. So this is America. And I think what I saw is how much hope there is there. I think but I saw, you mentioned a $30 billion number and a $250 billion set of investments. What people don't know is that the Department of Agriculture, this budget that has also taken a huge whack in this, as the Senator mentioned, it actually is an investor in rural America. And you mentioned that a budget safeguards and helps level the playing field. Well, a budget also helps invest and make the whole thing go. So pulling out the props, the little bits of money that have a powerful multiplier effect. You take a fund like the CDFI fund. All it does with its $250 million is reinvest those over and over and over, 12 to 1. What are rural water grants? Those are grants that get spent to stretch out water systems for the entire country. So what's baffling to me in this is that we actually have systems that work and government systems that work and that are modestly priced. In fact, most of the systems that I saw at the Department of Agriculture make money for the country. Many of them, we actually earn income on the kind of investments that we do. So anyway, I think you asked me to say two things about rural and about the infrastructure investments. I think what I'd like people to walk away from is when we think about housing or businesses or critical infrastructure, the federal partnership, those federal dollars, only the federal government can go in for such a long-term, 40-year money in some cases, and take an investment role that is so stimulative for everybody else. So you set up a fund at Treasury to invest in some of the most powerful institutions, those community development financial institutions, and they'll turn that money over and over and over again. And that's just smart. And I just hope that with folks like Senator Van Hollen, we stay the course.
It's a great point on making the smart investments. And Neil, I think that's a good time to turn to you. So one of the things that President Trump's budget would eliminate is the Manufacturing Extension Partnership. On the campaign trail, President Trump and now as president has said, over and over and over again that he plans to bring back manufacturing jobs, that he's cut this program that's really a lifeline for a lot of small and medium-sized manufacturers across the country. So can you talk a little bit about what this program is, what it does, and then to Lisa's point about investment and getting bang for our buck, how that works?
Yeah, no, I think Lisa hit the nail on the head here in terms of multiplier effects. What a lot of folks don't really realize is that the vast majority of manufacturing in the United States are small and medium-sized enterprises. And so you can tout small deals that you're doing to save jobs with in large corporations, or claim to be saving jobs. But the truth is, if you really want to have a big bang for your buck, you have to do more to support that small, medium-sized enterprise sector. So the Manufacturing Extension Partnership was established in the 80s as a network. Every state in the country has MEP centers, and these centers are specifically focused on helping these companies learn about the latest state of the market technologies, helping them improve their productivity, and helping them embrace sound business practices. What folks don't realize, perhaps, if they're trying to put a program like this on the chopping block, is that this program has been wildly successful and has not provided any indication for a need for cut. So I've got my cheat sheet here. A recent study just came out, and we're talking about a very small appropriation. So we're talking about a $130 million federal program, right? For $130 million in federal appropriations, they're matched by $160 million in fees, state, and local contributions. And in a single year, with that $130 million appropriation, the MEP creates about 140 to 575,000 jobs a year. In a single year, with $130 million in federal appropriations, that's generating between $15 and $63 billion of GDP. And it creates $30 to $130 billion in output, $8 to $34 billion in personal income, and between $1 and $4.66 billion in returns to the Treasury. So when we're talking about killing a program like the Manufacturing Extension Partnership, you're not only cutting into U.S. competitiveness, but you're also basically going to be contributing to the national debt, because we're seeding these returns, and we're obviously seeding that kind of GDP growth.
So you're saying we shouldn't cut it?
Yes, that's correct.
Andrew, going back to you. One of the things that Senator Van Hollen mentioned is this plan this is one of the things that the Freedom Caucus has tried to extract, is eliminating the essential health benefits provision from the Affordable Care Act. So this requires that insurers provide a minimum level of care to the individuals they cover. It covers a wide array of things. So I'll just name a few: pregnancy, maternity, and newborn care, preventive care, prescription drugs, emergency and outpatient services, coverage for mental health and substance abuse disorder services, and much more. So basically everything that you think of when you think of healthcare. So can you talk about what that coverage is meant for the ACA and what the impact is on families that have been struggling with mental health or substance abuse addiction, and what it means if it's eliminated? And then, what does it mean for rural communities where we've really heard about the opioid crisis striking hard, and then what does it mean for communities more broadly?
Well, the biggest concern we have over that elimination when it pertains to substance abuse and mental health services is the lifetime caps that would be potentially back in place. With lifetime caps eliminated, people can receive and be confident they can receive a lifetime of care. This is not a disease that you, like in Hollywood, 28 days in rehab, out the door, have a nice life, you're clean, it's over. The average person goes through rehabilitation 7 times. And that could speak to a need to have better regulation of our, no one's really sure why. It is a chronic condition, and some people beat it the first time, some people never beat it. But you see that with every chronic disease. And so I know someone who works on the mental health side and said, what do you do when your 16-year-old has hit their lifetime cap? They're 16 years old and they've been getting mental health services since they were very young, whether it be for any number of mental health disorders, or someone who develops psychosis or schizophrenia when they're 19 or 20, and you hit your lifetime cap after a few years. That's why the essential health benefit is so important, because of the way it addresses those lifetime caps. The other part of the essential health benefit is it really was a monumental moment for our movement because we had just passed a few years earlier the Mental Health and Addiction Parity Act, which said that any healthcare plan that offers behavioral health services must offer them at the same level as general services, general health and surgical services. So it wasn't mandatory that behavioral health services be covered, but if they were to be covered, they had to be covered at the same rate. And then that was adopted into the Affordable Care Act. Any plan offered under the Affordable Care Act had to meet those parity requirements as well. So becoming an essential health benefit and getting parity into the ACA was a huge victory for us. And the reason was, let's get back to that theme of investment. The impact on the economy, whether it be an urban or a rural area, of substance abuse is devastating. It costs hundreds of billions of dollars, and that is not an exaggeration. It literally costs hundreds of billions of dollars to the economy, not just in healthcare, but in criminal justice costs, destruction of property, and especially lost productivity. And it's an investment not only in human capital, but in actual capital as well. The Bureau of Labor Statistics has forecasted that because of the amount of expansion we've seen in services, because of parity, because of the ACA, we're going to need an additional 20,000 substance use disorder professionals to handle the workload within the next 8 years. And it is a profession that is not highly paid. It is a profession that sees a lot of burnout because of the high stress involved. And it's also a profession that requires a lot of training in trade for that low salary and high burnout. So, we keep coming back to that theme of investment. We need to invest in, like I said, infrastructure, bricks and mortar. We need the professionals to fill those centers, and we need to have treatment at a very high level that is innovative, that is based on technology. And that's another thing about the budget. Innovation is key. We're still a young field when it comes to the medical side of substance abuse. People have been treating cancer and other diseases for centuries. When it comes to the actual medical treatment of addiction, it's a pretty new field. So innovation is very, very important. We have to make that investment in innovation in neuroscience and how to translate that neuroscience into treatment. And when it comes to the rural area, I can tell you that I know firsthand of a program in California that received a $9 million loan from the Department of Agriculture at a very low rate to build a brand new treatment center in a rural county in Nevada County, California. And one of the selling points was the pass-through of that money into the community. Every dollar invested in that community passed through the community, all in the name of treating substance abuse. So the innovation and the investment and the return on investment in lost productivity alone and decreasing court costs is almost incalculable.
And I think you bring up a good point. The impact on people's lives is essential, but there also is a really critical economic impact to all of these cuts. It's not just that people will be hurt, it's that local economies will suffer as well. So to that point, there are actually some Republican governors who had looked at this budget and have kind of balked at some of the cuts that would really hit them, and they've got to think about their local economies, so this is concerning. So for example, in Kentucky, Governor Matt Bevin, in Alabama, Governor Robert Bentley have criticized the elimination of the Appalachian Regional Commission and the Delta Regional Authority because they send billions of dollars to their states each year to handle economic challenges. So Lisa, can you talk a little bit about what the unique economic challenges are facing the Delta region and Appalachia, and why those regions need that federal investment to thrive?
The question of persistent poverty in America is very, very heavily a rural question. Of the counties in America where poverty has been persistent for over 3 decades, that's high levels of poverty, we call it over 20%. 85% of those counties are rural, and mostly sitting in Republican member districts. I spent most of my service often meeting with Republican governors, Republican members of Congress, Republican senators. It is the thing that unifies us. Every senator's got a rural spot somewhere. And I think the critical point here, since we want to fix this is the point about inclusivity. This is about we're not done. So when Governor Bevin and I toured a small hospital in Kentucky, and we got to the wing, which was an Alzheimer's wing for inpatient services. And the people, serenaded us. They were singing. And you realize how healthy this is. What a wonderful boost for this community. You realize the layer of jobs that were just created, good jobs. It was a CDFI who helped finance that hospital expansion. And you just saw all the parts of the system working well for investment. We needed the hospital expansion. We needed the jobs. The elderly people with early stage dementia needed this kind of facility, the kind of adult daycare that could, the treatment, the short periods, short stay periods. You saw it all working. And where I think there's a note of pushing for some more winners in this budget is with the members and the governors who see that we're so not done yet. This is the kind of work that needs to happen. And when CDFIs are in the mix, they're the groups that work the deal, that push it, that keep bringing in the sides of monies. And we've started a campaign called CDFIs Invest. If you want to know what to do, join us on that, because those are the kind of groups that'll fight the fight, work across bipartisan lines, work for that money over time to do the kind of investments. So that's what we're hoping.
So Neil, one of the aspects of the budget that is near and dear to my heart working on workforce development is access to job training and employment services. So the budget would levy a 21% cut across the Department of Labor. Some analysis from us and others put that cut for job training at somewhere between 35 and 50%. Again, going back to what President Trump has promised, one recurring theme over time has been jobs. So the cuts to Department of Labor seem particularly abrupt. So it would seem that job training is probably an essential aspect of economic development. So can you talk about, in your experience working at the Department of Commerce with the Economic Development Administration, what is the interplay there between job training and building up local communities?
No, it's an excellent question. Actually, if you think about it, and there have been plenty of people who've studied economic development over the years, from McKinsey to BDG to government agencies, and you think about what can you do to attract investment, whether it's government investment or large private investment into a community. A company is going to move in, or a series of companies or employers are going to move into a community if they're going to have access to critical resources that they need to thrive. So if you want to, Spartanburg, South Carolina, several years ago, they were shifting from a textile and agrarian community to they wanted to go into the automotive industry. So what did they do? They started to set up a workforce development initiative, working with community colleges to make sure that they had specialized training for their workforce in automotive industry skills for that kind of industry. They set up a research and development center specifically focused around automotive at Clemson. They set up infrastructure for facilitating import and export with trains that could go straight to the Port of Charleston. They set up great MEP programs to enhance small, medium-sized suppliers. So you have that whole ecosystem that works together. And there's not one single factor that's more important, but if you bring that all together, specialize on a particular area, then you're going to have a robust, economically developmental area. And Spartanburg's just one example. There are countless others. And the Obama administration actually tried really hard to bring that full one government approach, working with the Department of Agriculture, Department of Labor, Department of Commerce, DOD, and others to take that holistic approach. Now, there are agencies like the Economic Development Administration that was the only agency that's focused exclusively on economic development, and they serve as glue to bring in the Department of Transportation for things like Tiger Grants, which is what Senator Van Hollen described, or to work with NSF to set up R&D centers. And so these kinds of agencies are really helpful not only in bringing important resources to bear in the community, but also helping integrate those other factors from other departments. So Department of Commerce can work with a company and maybe identify where those skill gaps are. Department of Labor can work with a community college system and help develop programs that will tailor the skills that are being developed to those skills gaps.
And I think that that's a great point that kind of wraps up a lot of the things that we've been talking about in terms of an ecosystem. You know, all of these programs, we're talking about a lot of different areas, but ultimately they're working together toward similar goals. So Harry, I'm going to give you the last word. I'm going to ask for, I won't ask for your prediction on the healthcare vote today, because if you know, you probably know more than most people, probably everyone. But I do want to ask, so we've talked a lot about this budget. Ultimately, this is just a preview. This is also, in some ways, I think a lot of members of Congress would say this is sort of dead on arrival, you know, for reasons that they don't really love the cuts that the administration has made, and also they want to have a chance to make some decisions for themselves. So what happens after this? What do we expect now that the skinny budget is out there?
So I think that the most important thing to keep in mind just politically with the skinny budget, with healthcare, with the rest of the budget, is that the extent to which this is not just the Trump agenda, but it's the Trump-Ryan agenda. They really are in lockstep as far as what they want to see. And I think there's a lot of press coverage of tactical differences, or, you know, is there a rift? Do these guys not get along personally? But I don't know. But they have the same agenda. It's actually kind of remarkable with the skinny budget. You know, the basic shape of this is increased defense, cut non-defense. Paul Ryan did the same thing in 2013. That was the Ryan budget like a couple of years ago. What was interesting then was that Congress actually, they voted for his budget. This was a Republican House. They voted for his budget. But then they couldn't actually pass the appropriations bills to make those cuts. When it got specific, they said no. And hopefully the same thing happens this time around. And then they have to actually work towards a deal that actually works for rural areas and works for substance abuse and works for manufacturing. Hopefully that's what happens, but we'll see. I think, do members of Congress stick up for their constituents, or do they just go along with what Trump and Ryan want? Either way, though, that really is just the tip of the iceberg. You know, we've got budgets coming out later in the year from both Trump and from Congress that will deal not just with these discretionary programs, but also we'll see probably huge safety net cuts. Trump has said he's not going to cut Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. We've already seen him break that promise on Medicaid, and we'll see on the other programs, and also on the tax side. Again, so much of this is going to drive towards how do you cut taxes for the wealthiest Americans. And so, you know, I think we're really going to see, as the year unfolds, is how do we think this country works? You know, do we think that the way that you get the economy moving is when you invest in rural areas and lift people up and invest in small and medium manufacturers, address problems like substance abuse? Or do you just sweep them under the rug and you know, give maybe some rhetoric and slogans, but you don't actually do anything for them? Because what you really think is that what the economy needs is tax cuts for the biggest corporations and for millionaires and billionaires, and, you know, deal making where the economy sort of works on a deal-by-deal basis, where the president says, okay, CEO of Anthem, you support my health care bill, I'll approve your merger with Cigna. That's actually a thing that's happening, by the way. I think that's really going to be the question, is this Trump and Ryan vision of America, that apparently Ryan was the guy standing around a keg cooking this up. Sounds like a great, fun time. Is that the vision that we have, or do members of Congress say no, that's, even if we're Republicans, that's not the kind of vision that we want to see, and we're going to strive for something that actually does work for ordinary people?
Thanks. So we've got time for 2 questions. Shannon's going to be going around with a microphone.
The only one again? I gather we kind of heard about health care. Reform is on life support, and with luck, it's gonna sink soon. Do I hear that this skinny budget is dead on arrival, or do you think it's another battle that's going to be a battle royal?
Dead on arrival is a very definite phrase, and we don't work in definites and concrete terms when it comes to a budget. I know several appropriators from both parties, and their offices have said, yes, it is, for the most part, going to be, you know, follow along the lines of that old adage that Senator Van Hollen referred to: President proposes, Congress disposes. But when the president proposes, especially a president of the same party of the majority of both chambers, it's usually at the very least a starting point, a floor. And my question to most appropriators has been, okay, if you're throwing this out, what is the floor we're working from? Is it FY16, FY16 CR, FY17 CR? Are we even going to see FY17 finished, or is that going to be a year-long CR? So when we're talking about FY18, we're not done with FY17 yet. So dead on arrival is too definitive a term, in my opinion, because there's too many moving parts. However, a lot of programs that a lot of powerful appropriators are interested in were slated for elimination, and you can be sure that there will be some pushback. But the question for all of us is where's the floor? And keep in mind, we're back to the sequester. The Ryan budget, I remember the Ryan budget, and I remember following him the Price budget. Where's Mr. Price right now? He's over at HHS. And they weren't that different, and it's not that different than what we're seeing right now. And first we needed the Ryan Murray deal for some sequester relief. Then we needed another deal on top of that for more sequester relief. There's no sequester relief for 18. So even the president's skinny budget, proposing a $54 billion increase in the military, violates the spending caps. So, there's a lot of moving parts, too many to say dead on arrival.
Well, and also you have folks like John McCain, who's advocating for a far larger defense increase, saying this is dead on arrival because it's too low. Where's the floor?
All right, we've got time for one more. Gentleman right here.
Thank you. Gerald Chandler. The trustees of Medicare and Social Security have said in the long term we're going to run out of money unless we do something. What do you propose be done?
That's a big question. So I think first it's important to be clear what happens when the trust fund runs out of the surpluses that have been built up over the years as taxes have exceeded the benefits that have gone out. And for both programs, it's not as if benefits stop, it's that they're reduced. So I think that Social Security, it's something on the order of 75 or 80% of benefits would still be able to be paid with revenue coming in, even without a trust fund. And for Medicare, I think it's something similar. What I would say on both is there's no, I think that there's a sort of picture that people like Paul Ryan, and I think you'll probably see this from Trump too, try to paint, of these programs being bankrupt or kind of just hopelessly broken. And nothing could be further from the truth. You look at the overall budget, including Social Security and Medicare, and right now we're taxing, when you look at the advanced economies in the world, we're like the 5th lowest taxed country among like 35 advanced economies. If we were the 6th lowest taxed country, you'd stabilize the debt as a share of the economy, keep Social Security, keep Medicare with no cuts. And of course, you can do even less if you're, I think in particular Medicare, there's places to look for efficiencies that aren't cutting benefits, that are looking at, are we paying drug companies too much? Are we paying the health industry too much? But I think that the main thing to keep in mind here is that this idea of kind of national bankruptcy is oftentimes used to try to create the illusion that we don't have a choice here. We just have to take Ryan Care for Medicare. We just have to privatize Social Security. And nothing can be further from the truth. We absolutely have a choice. And we don't even have to radically remake the country to keep these programs. Population's getting older. We're going to have to make changes. But the basic structure of those programs worked. It's worked for decades. And it can continue to work.
Americans want it to.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I think you want to look at so first of all, like the Affordable Care Act actually takes a step in the right direction here. There's a surtax on wages in the Affordable Care Act. This is one of the tax cuts for the wealthy in repeal. And that extends the life of the Medicare Trust Fund. If you repeal that, you cause the Medicare Trust Fund to lose resources. And I think there's things like that you can do, focusing on the wealthiest people and on tax loopholes and places where that money should already be coming into the system and isn't. And then you look on the spending side and find efficiencies where you can. But I would not fundamentally dismantle or unmake those programs, and there's no imperative to do that.
All right, thank you all for coming out, and please join me in thanking our panelists.